The gray London morning matched the tension that had been building for weeks between the Russian delegation and their British hosts. Colonel Dmitry Volkov stepped out of the black diplomatic vehicle, his crisp naval infantry uniform catching the weak sunlight filtering through the clouds above Buckingham Palace. The red and gold insignia on his chest gleamed with the authority of the Russian Marine Corps, each medal telling a story of service in places most people couldn't pronounce. Volkov was not a man accustomed to being ignored or dismissed. At 42 years old, he had commanded respect from Siberian training grounds to Syrian battlefields. His broad shoulders and stern expression had intimidated generals and politicians across 2 continents. Today, however, he was simply part of a routine diplomatic visit, accompanying a trade delegation that was supposed to smooth over recent tensions between Moscow and London. The palace gates loomed before him, ornate and imposing, flanked by 2 figures that seemed almost like statues. The Queen's Guard stood at perfect attention, their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats making them appear more like ceremonial decorations than actual soldiers. Volkov had heard about these guards during his military education, how they were considered elite troops despite their theatrical appearance. He had always assumed it was British propaganda, a way to make tourists believe that men in funny hats could actually fight. As he approached the main entrance with the rest of the delegation, Volkov noticed how the guards remained completely motionless. Their faces were hidden beneath the shadows of their massive hats, but their posture suggested years of disciplined training. Still, to a man who had fought in actual combat zones, they looked more like museum pieces than warriors. The delegation was led by Ambassador Petrov, a diplomatic veteran who had spent decades navigating the complex relationships between Russia and the West. Petrov had specifically briefed his team about British protocols and the importance of showing proper respect during their visit. He had emphasized that any incidents could have serious consequences for the ongoing trade negotiations. But Volkov had only half listened to these warnings. In his experience, respect was earned through strength, not through following outdated ceremonies created for tourists and tabloid newspapers. He believed that real soldiers recognized real soldiers, regardless of nationality or uniform. The British military, he assumed, would understand that a decorated Russian Marine deserved acknowledgement of his rank and experience. As they waited for their escort to arrive, Volkov found himself studying the guard closest to him. The young man appeared to be in his early 20s, standing with rifle at shoulder arms, eyes fixed on some distant point. His red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. But to Volkov, he looked soft, untested by real combat. The Russian colonel had fought in Chechnya before these guards were even born. He had led men through urban warfare in Grozny, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. He had commanded Marine units during the Syrian deployment, coordinating with local forces while under constant threat of ambush. These experiences had shaped his understanding of military hierarchy and mutual respect between professional soldiers. When their British escort finally arrived, there was a brief delay in the paperwork, some confusion about security clearances that required additional verification. The delegation was asked to wait just outside the main entrance while the matter was resolved. Ambassador Petrov used the opportunity to make some phone calls, while other delegation members took photos and chatted quietly among themselves. Volkov, however, grew increasingly frustrated with the wait. In Russia, his rank would have expedited any such process. Military officers received immediate respect and assistance from both civilian and military personnel. The idea that he should stand around like a common tourist while bureaucrats shuffled papers struck him as deeply disrespectful. He walked closer to the guard, expecting at least some acknowledgement of his presence. Military courtesy demanded that soldiers recognize each other's rank, regardless of nationality. Volkov had experienced this mutual respect during joint exercises with NATO forces, where professional soldiers maintained certain standards of interaction even during tense political periods. The guard remained motionless, eyes focused forward, showing no sign that he had even noticed the Russian officer's approach. This complete lack of response puzzled Volkov. He was accustomed to being recognized and saluted by junior officers, and while he didn't expect a salute from a foreign soldier, he at least expected some kind of acknowledgement. Volkov cleared his throat softly, but the guard's posture didn't change by even a millimeter. The Russian colonel studied the young man's face, what little he could see beneath the shadow of the bearskin hat. The guard's jaw was set firmly, his breathing controlled and steady. Everything about his bearing suggested serious military training, but Volkov still couldn't shake the impression that this was all for show. The delegation's delay stretched on, and Volkov's patience grew thinner. In his mind, this was becoming a matter of professional respect. Here he was, a senior officer with decades of combat experience, being ignored by what appeared to be a ceremonial guard whose primary job was to look impressive for tourists. Ambassador Petrov noticed his colonel's growing agitation and approached him quietly. "Dmitri, please remember what we discussed about protocols. These guards are not permitted to break their posts or engage in conversation during duty hours. It's nothing personal." But Volkov was beyond such diplomatic explanations. He had reached a point where he felt his military honor was being questioned. In the Russian military culture, he knew ignoring a senior officer was unthinkable. Even enemy officers in prisoner exchanges were afforded basic military courtesies. The complete lack of response from this British guard struck him as deliberately insulting. The colonel decided that this situation required direct action. If diplomatic niceties weren't working, perhaps military directness would achieve better results. He had spent his career dealing with difficult situations by taking charge and making his authority clear. This seemed like another such moment. Volkov positioned himself directly in front of the guard, close enough that his presence could not be ignored. He straightened his uniform jacket, ensuring that his rank insignia and medals were clearly visible. Then, in his most authoritative voice, he addressed the motionless figure before him. "Soldier," he said in heavily accented but clear English, "I am Colonel Dmitri Volkov of the Russian Marine Corps. I have served my country for over 20 years in multiple combat zones. I demand that you show proper military courtesy to a fellow officer." The guard's response was exactly the same as before: absolute stillness and silence. Not even a flicker of recognition crossed his visible features. To any observer, it might have appeared that Volkov was talking to a statue rather than a living person. This complete lack of response triggered something in Volkov's military mindset. He had dealt with insubordination before, and in his experience, it required immediate and firm correction. Young soldiers needed to learn respect for rank and experience, regardless of circumstances. He decided that this British guard needed a lesson in military hierarchy. The colonel stepped even closer, his voice rising slightly, but still maintaining the controlled tone of military command. "I am speaking to you, soldier. In any professional military, officers acknowledge each other with appropriate respect. Your silence is an insult to both our uniforms." Several members of the delegation had begun to notice the interaction, including Ambassador Petrov, whose expression showed growing concern. The ambassador knew that any incident involving their military representative could derail the entire diplomatic mission. He started moving toward Volkov, intending to intervene before the situation escalated further. But Volkov was operating on military instincts now, not diplomatic ones. He had identified what he perceived as a challenge to his authority, and his training told him to meet that challenge head-on. In combat situations, hesitation could be fatal. In military hierarchies, allowing disrespect to go uncorrected could undermine command authority. The Russian colonel reached into his pocket and pulled out his military identification, holding it up close to the guard's face. "Look at these credentials, soldier. Look at these medals. I have fought in real wars while you stand here playing dress-up for tourists. Show some respect for actual military service." The identification displayed Volkov's rank, his unit assignments, and several commendations for combat service. It was an impressive record by any military standard, representing decades of dedicated service to his country. But the guard's response remained unchanged. Perfect stillness, eyes fixed forward, breathing steady and controlled. This final lack of acknowledgement pushed Volkov past his limit of patience. In his world view, he had given this young soldier multiple opportunities to show proper military courtesy. He had identified himself clearly, displayed his credentials, and explained his expectations. The continued silence now seemed like deliberate insubordination that demanded corrective action. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed in diplomatic circles for months afterward. Colonel Dmitry Volkov, decorated veteran of multiple conflicts, made a decision that would test centuries of British military protocol and international diplomatic relations. He decided that if words wouldn't earn him the respect he deserved, perhaps actions would be more effective. The morning air was still and quiet around Buckingham Palace, as Volkov prepared to take the kind of direct action that had served him well throughout his military career. He had no way of knowing that he was about to encounter a level of training and discipline that would challenge everything he thought he knew about military bearing and protocol. Ambassador Petrov was now moving quickly toward his colonel, recognizing the signs of escalating confrontation. But diplomatic interventions operate on a different timeline than military decisions. Volkov had already committed to his course of action, driven by decades of training that told him weakness in the face of disrespect would only invite further challenges. The guard remained motionless, a perfect example of British military discipline and protocol. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, though few civilians understood the depth of preparation required to maintain such composure under pressure. What appeared to Volkov as theatrical display was actually the result of rigorous selection and training processes that eliminated anyone unable to maintain absolute discipline under any circumstances. Other members of the Russian delegation had stopped their conversations, sensing that something significant was developing near the palace entrance. The contrast between their growing awareness and the guard's continued stillness created a tension that seemed to charge the very air around them. Colonel Volkov adjusted his stance, his military bearing evident in every movement. He had made his decision, and now he would follow through with the kind of determination that had earned him respect and promotion throughout his career. In his mind, this was about more than just personal recognition. It was about maintaining the honor and dignity of the Russian military in the face of apparent British disrespect. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of military protocol, diplomatic relations, and personal pride. Two military traditions, shaped by different histories and cultures, were about to meet in a clash that neither side had anticipated, but both were prepared for in their own ways. Colonel Volkov reached out and firmly grasped the guard's shoulder, intending to force acknowledgement of his presence and rank. In the Russian military, such direct physical contact between senior and junior officers was not uncommon during instruction or correction. Physical presence often reinforced verbal authority, and Volkov expected this action to finally break through what he perceived as stubborn disrespect. The moment his hand made contact with the red tunic, several things happened simultaneously. The guard's training kicked in with mechanical precision, his body moving in ways that demonstrated years of preparation for exactly this scenario. His rifle shifted position with fluid efficiency, the bayonet now angled in a way that suggested serious intent rather than ceremonial display. "Step back immediately, sir." The guard's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp and commanding despite his apparent youth. The transformation was startling. The motionless statue had become a clearly competent soldier in an instant. "You are interfering with a Queen's Guard on active duty." Volkov was taken aback by the sudden response, but his military instincts interpreted the guard's reaction as escalation rather than legitimate defense. In his experience, junior soldiers who raised their weapons against senior officers needed immediate and decisive correction. The Russian colonel's combat training kicked in, and he stepped forward rather than back, closing the distance between them. "You dare point a weapon at a senior officer?" Volkov's voice carried the authority of decades commanding troops in hostile environments. "Lower that rifle and show proper respect, or I will report your insubordination to your commanding officer." The guard's response was immediate and professional. "Sir, you are in violation of security protocols at Buckingham Palace. Take 3 steps backward and keep your hands visible, or additional security measures will be implemented." By now, the commotion had attracted the attention of palace security personnel who had been monitoring the situation through various observation points. The incident was being recorded and analyzed in real time by professionals trained to distinguish between genuine threats and diplomatic misunderstandings. However, the protocols they followed made no distinction based on a person's military rank or nationality when it came to protecting the royal residence. Ambassador Petrov reached the scene just as the confrontation reached this critical point. His diplomatic experience told him that both men were now operating according to their respective military training, which meant the situation could escalate rapidly beyond any reasonable diplomatic solution. "Colonel Volkov, step back immediately," Petrov commanded in Russian, using the tone reserved for preventing international incidents. "This is not a military exercise. This is a diplomatic mission on foreign soil." But Volkov was no longer thinking like a diplomat. The guard's firm response had triggered his combat mindset, where backing down from a challenge could signal weakness to other potential threats. In urban warfare scenarios, showing uncertainty or retreating under pressure often invited attack from enemy forces who interpreted such behavior as tactical vulnerability. "This soldier has raised a weapon against a senior Allied officer," Volkov replied without taking his eyes off the guard. "Such behavior cannot be tolerated by any professional military." The British Guard maintained his position with absolute steadiness, his training having prepared him for confrontations with individuals who might not understand or respect palace protocols. His awareness extended beyond the immediate threat to include the positioning of other delegation members, potential escape routes, and backup security measures that could be activated if necessary. What most observers didn't realize was that this guard, Lance Corporal James Morrison of the Coldstream Guards, had completed multiple tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties. His motionless stance during normal duty hours was not the result of purely ceremonial training, but rather an adaptation of combat skills learned during months of sentry duty in hostile territory where movement or distraction could prove fatal. Morrison's selection for Queen's Guard duty had required passing some of the most rigorous military assessments in the British Army. Physical fitness, marksmanship, psychological stability, and the ability to maintain absolute discipline under extreme pressure were all prerequisites. The ceremonial aspects of the role were actually secondary to the security responsibilities that few civilians understood. Additional palace security had begun moving into position, though their approach was subtle enough that most of the delegation remained unaware of the developing response. Plainclothes officers, surveillance specialists, and quick reaction teams were all being activated according to protocols designed to handle various levels of security concern. The situation had also attracted the attention of other Queen's Guards stationed around the palace perimeter. While they remained at their assigned positions, their level of alertness had increased significantly. Radio communications were passing information about the incident to command centers where senior officers were beginning to take direct interest in the developing confrontation. Colonel Volkov made another attempt to assert his authority, this time using diplomatic credentials rather than purely military ones. "I am here as part of an official delegation invited by your government. This soldier's behavior is creating an international incident." Morrison's response demonstrated the sophisticated training that goes into preparing guards for such complex situations. "Sir, your diplomatic status does not override security protocols when you physically interfere with palace security. Please comply with instructions to step back and keep your hands visible." The guard's ability to maintain professional calm while clearly articulating legal and security requirements impressed even some members of the delegation who had initially sided with their colonel. This was not the behavior of an untrained ceremonial soldier, but rather the measured response of someone with genuine military credentials and legal authority. Ambassador Petrov realized that the situation had moved beyond simple misunderstanding into a realm where both British and Russian protocols were being tested. His experience told him that both the guard and his colonel were now operating according to legitimate military procedures, which meant that resolution would require careful navigation of competing authorities. The ambassador approached the guard directly, using his diplomatic credentials to create a bridge between the competing military protocols. "Lance Corporal, I am Ambassador Petrov, head of the Russian delegation. I take full responsibility for my officers' actions and request permission to resolve this matter through proper diplomatic channels." Morrison acknowledged the ambassador with a slight nod, but his primary attention remained focused on Colonel Volkov, who still represented the immediate security concern. "Mr. Ambassador, your officer must comply with security protocols before any diplomatic resolution can be considered." This response revealed another layer of the guard's training: the ability to handle multiple levels of authority simultaneously while maintaining security priorities. Diplomatic considerations were important, but they could not override immediate safety protocols when someone had already demonstrated willingness to ignore established boundaries. Colonel Volkov found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His military training told him that he was in the right to demand respect from a junior soldier, but the diplomatic context was making his position more difficult to maintain. Additionally, the guard's professional competence was becoming undeniable, even to someone who had initially dismissed him as purely ceremonial. The Russian colonel attempted a different approach, addressing the guard as one professional soldier to another. "Corporal, I respect your dedication to duty, but surely you understand that military officers must show courtesy to each other, regardless of nationality." Morrison's response revealed both his training and his understanding of the broader situation. "Sir, I show respect for all visiting officers by ensuring their safety and security while on palace grounds. This requires strict adherence to established protocols that protect both visitors and residents." This answer demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how security and respect intersected in his role. The guard was not dismissing Volkov's rank or experience, but rather explaining how his duties required him to treat all visitors according to consistent standards that ultimately served their protection. The explanation helped Ambassador Petrov see a path toward resolution that could satisfy both sides while avoiding lasting diplomatic damage. The guard's professionalism provided an opportunity to reframe the incident as a misunderstanding between different military cultures rather than a deliberate insult or security threat. However, the situation was complicated by the arrival of additional British military personnel. A staff sergeant from the Coldstream Guards approached the group with the measured pace of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations that required both military authority and diplomatic sensitivity. Staff Sergeant Williams had been monitoring the situation from the guardroom and had decided that direct intervention was necessary to prevent further escalation. His arrival represented a shift in the incident's dynamics, as he brought both the authority to make decisions about protocol enforcement and the experience to understand the cultural factors contributing to the misunderstanding. "Gentlemen, Williams addressed the group with the calm authority of 20 years military experience. I believe we have a situation that can be resolved through mutual understanding and respect for each other's military traditions. His approach immediately changed the atmosphere around the confrontation. Rather than focusing on who was right or wrong, he was offering a framework for resolution that acknowledged the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. Colonel Volkov recognized in the staff sergeant someone with genuine combat experience and command authority. The British NCO's bearing and tone suggested that he was someone who understood military hierarchy and the importance of maintaining respect between professional soldiers. Lance Corporal Morrison maintained his alert posture but allowed his senior NCO to take the lead in managing the diplomatic aspects of the situation. His continued readiness demonstrated that security protocols remained in effect, but the arrival of additional authority created opportunities for de-escalation. The staff sergeant's next words would prove crucial in determining whether this incident would be remembered as a diplomatic embarrassment or an example of how professional militaries could navigate cultural differences while maintaining their respective standards and responsibilities. Staff Sergeant Williams studied the faces of both Colonel Volkov and Lance Corporal Morrison before speaking, recognizing that his words would determine whether this incident escalated into a major diplomatic crisis or resolved into a learning experience for all involved. Colonel Volkov, Williams began, his tone respectful but firm. I understand your expectation of military courtesy between professional soldiers. In most circumstances, you would be absolutely correct. However, the Queen's Guard operates under unique protocols that supersede normal military social interactions during active duty periods. The staff sergeant's approach was masterful in its acknowledgement of Volkov's legitimate expectations while explaining the specific context that made normal protocols inapplicable. He continued, Lance Corporal Morrison is following procedures that have been developed over centuries to ensure the security of the royal residence. These procedures require him to maintain position and alertness that may appear discourteous to visitors unfamiliar with our protocols. Williams then turned slightly toward Morrison, including him in the conversation while maintaining his authority over the situation. Corporal Morrison, given the diplomatic nature of this visit and the misunderstanding that has occurred, would it be possible to briefly explain your background to Colonel Volkov? I believe this might help our Russian colleague understand the professional standards he has encountered. Morrison nodded once, sharply, before addressing Volkov directly for the first time in a conversational rather than security-focused manner. Sir, I served 2 tours in Helmand Province with the Coldstream Guards before being selected for ceremonial duties. I was awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge and Commendation for service during Operation Herrick. The revelation hit Colonel Volkov like a physical blow. Helmand Province had been one of the most dangerous combat zones in Afghanistan, where British forces had faced sustained combat operations against experienced insurgent fighters. Any soldier who had completed multiple tours there and earned commendations possessed combat credentials that rivaled Volkov's own experience. Morrison continued, his tone remaining professional, but now carrying a subtle edge of pride in his service record. Selection for Queen's Guard requires completion of advanced weapons training, counter-terrorism certification, and psychological evaluation. We are responsible for the close protection of the royal family, not just ceremonial display. The information reframed everything Volkov had assumed about the young soldier he had dismissed as a theatrical decoration. The skills required for close protection duties in a modern security environment actually exceeded those needed for conventional combat operations. Morrison had been selected from among the most elite soldiers in the British Army. Ambassador Petrov watched the colonel's expression change as the implications became clear. The guard he had attempted to intimidate was not an inexperienced ceremonial soldier, but rather a combat veteran who had been entrusted with protecting the British head of state. The ambassador realized that his officer had unknowingly challenged someone whose security clearance and operational authority exceeded that of most military personnel. Staff Sergeant Williams seized the moment to provide additional context that would help both sides understand the broader situation. The Queen's Guard selection process requires candidates to demonstrate not only combat competence, but also the psychological stability to maintain absolute discipline under any circumstances. Lance Corporal Morrison's response to your approach, Colonel, was textbook execution of protocols designed to protect both the royal family and visiting dignitaries. This explanation helped Colonel Volkov understand that the Guard's initial silence had not been disrespect or insubordination, but rather professional execution of security procedures. The young soldier had been following training that required him to maintain alertness and position regardless of external pressures or distractions. Williams continued his explanation, addressing the cultural misunderstanding that had created the incident. In Russian military culture, as I understand it, senior officers expect immediate recognition and acknowledgement from junior personnel. This is a sign of respect and proper military bearing. However, British Palace security protocols require guards to maintain position and composure regardless of who approaches them, specifically to prevent manipulation by hostile individuals who might attempt to exploit normal social expectations. The staff sergeant's analysis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both military cultures and the security requirements that shaped British protocols. His explanation provided a framework for understanding how both sides had been operating according to legitimate professional standards that happened to conflict in this specific situation. Colonel Volkov found himself in the uncomfortable position of realizing that his assumptions had been entirely wrong. The soldier he had challenged was not only a decorated combat veteran, but also someone whose current responsibilities required skills and training that exceeded conventional military requirements. His attempt to assert authority had actually revealed his own ignorance about British military standards. The colonel's military integrity demanded that he acknowledge this new understanding, even though it meant admitting error in judgment. "Lance Corporal Morrison," he said slowly, "I apologize for my misunderstanding of your duties and qualifications. Your service record commands respect from any professional soldier." Morrison accepted the apology with a slight nod, his bearing remaining professional throughout. "Sir, no offense was taken. Cultural misunderstandings are common in our line of work. The important thing is maintaining security and diplomatic relationships." The mature response further impressed Colonel Volkov, who recognized the diplomatic skill required to de-escalate a situation while maintaining military bearing. This was not just a well-trained soldier, but someone with the interpersonal skills needed for complex security assignments. Staff Sergeant Williams used the moment of reconciliation to provide additional insight that would help prevent similar incidents in the future. "Colonel, I think you might be interested to know that Queen's Guard training includes cultural awareness modules specifically designed to help our personnel understand and work with military officers from allied nations. We recognize that different military traditions may create expectations that conflict with our security protocols. This revelation demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the Guard training program, which went far beyond the ceremonial aspects that most civilians associated with the role. The British military had invested significant resources in preparing their palace security personnel for exactly the kind of complex interactions that occurred during diplomatic visits. Ambassador Petrov stepped forward to formalize the resolution and ensure that the incident would not have lasting diplomatic consequences. "Staff Sergeant Williams, I want to express my appreciation for your professional handling of this situation. Colonel Volkov's actions reflected unfamiliarity with your protocols rather than any intentional disrespect." Williams accepted the ambassador's statement graciously while ensuring that the security implications were clearly understood. "Mr. Ambassador, we appreciate your delegation's cooperation. Perhaps it would be helpful if we provided a brief orientation about palace security procedures for future visits." The suggestion was diplomatic, but also practical, offering a way to prevent similar misunderstandings while maintaining security standards. It demonstrated the British military's ability to balance diplomatic considerations with operational requirements. As the immediate crisis passed, other members of the delegation began to relax and resume their conversations. However, the incident had created an opportunity for broader understanding between the military cultures represented by the two countries. Colonel Volkov requested permission to speak privately with Lance Corporal Morrison, recognizing that he had an opportunity to learn from someone with unique experience and training. The conversation that followed would prove educational for both soldiers, as they discovered common ground in their shared commitment to professional military service despite the differences in their specific roles and cultural backgrounds. Morrison explained the selection and training process for ceremonial duties, revealing the complexity of qualifications required and the ongoing operational responsibilities that extended far beyond what tourists observed. The guards were trained in counter-terrorism, close protection, crowd control, and diplomatic security, making them specialists in multiple military and security disciplines. Volkov shared his own combat experience and explained Russian military protocols that had shaped his initial expectations. This cultural exchange helped both soldiers understand how their respective training had prepared them differently for professional interactions, leading to the misunderstanding that had nearly created a diplomatic incident. The broader lesson that emerged from the incident was the importance of understanding context before making assumptions about military competence or cultural practices. Both sides had been operating according to legitimate professional standards, but the lack of cultural awareness had created unnecessary conflict. Staff Sergeant Williams later used the incident as a case study in training programs, demonstrating how cultural misunderstandings could escalate quickly if not handled with professional skill and diplomatic sensitivity. The incident became an example of how military personnel could maintain their standards while adapting to complex international situations. For Ambassador Petrov, the incident reinforced the importance of comprehensive cultural briefings for military personnel participating in diplomatic missions. He implemented new protocols requiring detailed orientation about host nation military customs and security procedures before future visits. Colonel Volkov returned to Russia with a new understanding of British military professionalism and the complexity of modern security operations. His report to military leadership emphasized the sophistication of British training programs and the high standards maintained by personnel in ceremonial roles. The incident ultimately strengthened rather than damaged relationships between the military representatives of both countries. The professional handling of the crisis by British personnel impressed the Russian delegation and demonstrated the value of maintaining disciplined protocols even under pressure. Lance Corporal Morrison continued his duties with enhanced appreciation for the diplomatic dimensions of his role. The incident had provided practical experience in managing complex situations involving senior foreign military officers while maintaining security standards. The story became part of the institutional memory of both military organizations, serving as an example of how professional soldiers could navigate cultural differences while maintaining their respective standards and responsibilities. It demonstrated that true military professionalism sometimes required acknowledging misunderstandings and adapting to different operational contexts. In the months that followed, the incident was occasionally referenced in military training programs as an example of how assumptions about foreign military practices could create unnecessary conflicts. The resolution demonstrated the importance of cultural awareness and professional communication in international military relationships. The ultimate lesson was that military competence and professionalism could take many different forms, and that true respect between soldiers required understanding the context and requirements that shaped each other's roles and responsibilities. Both Colonel Volkov and Lance Corporal Morrison had demonstrated their professional qualifications, but in ways that initially seemed incompatible until proper context was provided.